however, they're using African Americans early. Why? Because they need them for their combat service support. That's the modern day term we'll use. These are laborers, moving equipment, teamsters, building fortifications, building the transportation system. But I want you to appreciate something that the Confederacy is doing. They got manservants that are with their generals. They got African Americans building their transportation system, building their fortifications. And what are they doing? They're embedding a secret organization within their operations. The Loyal League has operatives inside the Confederacy. They're in every military capacity. What did Alan Pinkerton say? He said he found that the best source of information was the colored men who were employed in various capacities of military nature. The Confederacy has the Loyal League embedded. In fact, I will argue that the most loyal, what was considered the most loyal, quote, slaves, unquote, were Loyal League operatives. They're the ones most likely to be in this field glass where they're pickets, they're guards. So they're guarding the Confederate position, and they've given these African Americans muskets. They are trusted so much, they have muskets. So guess what Loyal League operatives can do? They can move in and out of the positions quite easily because they're the guards. They're guarding Confederate positions. This is a potential asset to the Union that the Union doesn't use at first. The first general that makes good use of African Americans is General Benjamin Butler. Butler would keep Maryland in the Union because of African American spies. Because of African American spies, Butler would arrest the mayor of Baltimore, the chief of police of Baltimore, and Lincoln would lift the writ of habeas corpus because he didn't want the spies to be uncovered. And Butler would keep Maryland in the Union. Butler would receive, after getting promoted by Lincoln and sent down to Fortress Monroe, he received 3 African Americans, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory. On the day that Virginia votes to secede from the Union, these 3 men show up. You think that's coincidence? They show up and they tell Butler they're using us to build their fortifications. So Butler says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to confiscate you as contraband of war because we don't want you to be used against the United States. And that's where Butler gets this concept from. But I want you to appreciate that these 3 men, they take the initiative to come in. Now, also the Loyal League, they're actually pretty confident in the Republican Party's leadership, to include Abraham Lincoln. They're actually pretty confident. This is very evident in an article in the Frederick Douglass Monthly in August of 1861 when Douglass writes, "We are happy to believe." Then he says, well, indeed, we have very good evidence to the fact that the administration in Washington, the Lincoln administration, notwithstanding appearances, stands ready to enforce a policy in the rebellious states that will eventually abolish slavery in those rebellious states, quote, just as soon as the people require it, close quote. What does Douglass mean by as soon as the people require it? The voice of the people in our federal government is Congress. As soon as Congress requires, as soon as Congress changes the laws. So the focus of the Loyal League early in the war is on the legislation that Lincoln will need to have an emancipation policy. Lincoln and Douglass do not believe that Congress will pass such legislation until it becomes, quote, an indispensable military necessity, close quote. In other words, when the majority in Congress understands that in order to save the Union, they need the help of African Americans. So now one of the objectives of the Loyal League is to convince Congress, a majority in Congress, that they need the help of African Americans in order to win the war. Butler, meanwhile, is very successful. While all the other generals are not being successful early in the war, Butler is the first to capture secessionist war because secessionist territory because he has Abraham Galloway working for him. Galloway would go down to North Carolina, actually go down to Virginia, tell Butler, okay, it's time to capture Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark there on Hatteras Island because they're building it up, and if you wait too long, it'll be a good fortification. And you know, the Pamlico Sound of North Carolina is where pirates used to hide back in the day. So this would be great for the blockade runners of the Confederacy. But Galloway goes to Butler and tells him, we got to do it. In fact, Butler says he has friends down in North Carolina that's telling him it's time to do it. That friend is Abraham Galloway. And Butler was captured at Hatteras Island in April of 1861. In the campaign in South Carolina with Abraham Galloway, this is a letter from General Edward Wild talking about how Galloway is such a good spy. And in this campaign, General Ambrose Burnside would take over in North Carolina, and Burnside would tell you about all the little colored boys and colored men that would come in and give him information. When he would capture Roanoke Island in February 1862, it's African American informants. When he goes into New Bern, he knows everything about the Confederacy in New Bern because Galloway is at work and he provides him information on everything the Confederacy is doing. He captures New Bern in March of '62. But one of the biggest events of the Civil War, and I would argue in the history of warfare, is the capture of Beaufort, North Carolina. Abraham Galloway organized fishermen there in North Carolina. He got the fishermen, these African-American fishermen, to put the Union soldiers on their boats, on their fishing boats. And in the early morning of April 23rd, 1862, these boats would pass right by Fort Macon within small arms fire. And the Confederate sentries, they wouldn't notice that anybody's on the boats. These are just the Negro fishermen. And so they headed in, they go into Beaufort, and the next morning, the citizens of Beaufort woke up and they were occupied by the Union Army. Not a single shot fired. Not one shot fired. Abraham Galloway at work. Fort Macon would be captured on April 26, 1862 because of these operations. And Burnside would become kind of a hero because he's getting such good information. It's Abraham Galloway. Let's go to Virginia. In Virginia, Mary Louvestre, also known as Trouvestre, she would save the blockade in Virginia by reporting on the Confederates changing this ship. This was the USS Merrimack, a wooden ship. And what the Confederates did, they converted it into an ironclad, the first ironclad. They're 90 days ahead of schedule. So Mary Louvestre, what she would do is she would commandeer these plans, make her way to Washington, turn it over to Gideon Welles and the Secretary of Navy so that the U.S. Navy would expedite the production of their own ironclad. And as a consequence of her work, they're able to neutralize the CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack. In Louisiana, you have another story that's like, I would argue, this is like a Trojan horse story that's so underreported it's shameful because this is a huge story in American history. See this guy right here, Jordan Noble? Jordan Noble is in that meeting in Cleveland. Immigrationist, right? He's a part of the secret society. Well, what does Jordan Noble do? In April of 1861, Jordan Noble convinces Governor Thomas More, the governor of Louisiana, to organize what is really about a battalion size, about 300 to 500 men of African-American soldiers as a part of the Confederate State Militia of Louisiana. Jordan Noble, a member of an African-American secret society, has convinced the governor to organize African-American soldiers to help defend New Orleans. And what do? They go to New Orleans, they become General Mansfield Lovell's defense of New Orleans. And what's critical, I want to point out in defense of New Orleans, this is Fort St. Philip, and Fort Jackson. There are heavy artilleries on this bluff. And that's where you want to stop a Navy from even getting close to New Orleans. But they got heavy artillery on the bluffs, and what do they need? They need gunpowder. So what Mansfield Lovell does is he produces about 8,000 pounds of gunpowder. He stores it in the old Marine Hospital. One of the operatives there is a guy by the name of Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and you may hear some scholars saying that he's a Creole. He's not. He's not even from Louisiana, but he's down in Louisiana at this time. Pinchback is a saboteur. And Pinchback the saboteur and other members of the Louisiana Native Guard are clearly involved in this arsenal being blown up on December 28, 1862. Correction, 1861. 8,000 pounds of gunpowder lost. In the True Delta New Orleans newspaper, they said it was the work of a fiend, which means it was a saboteur they did not catch. So now, remember these obstacles in the river? These obstacles become very important because since you're short on gunpowder, you need the artillery to hit every target. So you got to slow down the Navy. They can't go fast because you're going fast. You need a lot of artillery raining on them if they're going fast. But if they're going slow, you need to slow them down. So these obstacles are critical. Before the Union Navy starts up the river, 2 weeks before, these obstacles are destroyed by, quote, huge trees and a runaway barge. You know trees do not have a mind of their own and could not have jumped into that river. We also know that African-American laborers, enslaved persons, were chopping down trees, clearing fields of fire, and building fortifications. They're the best candidates for this act of sabotage. Admiral David Farragut, Commodore Farragut, is able to enter New Orleans with little or no ordered to burn down the U.S. Mint and withdraw from the city. The U.S. Mint still stands in New Orleans today. They did not withdraw from the city, and in August of 1862, they become Union soldiers. They edit 2 newspapers, 3 in a 3-year period right after the occupation. One is called Le Union, French newspaper. Le Union means the Union. Liberté, meaning liberty, and the Black Republican. It's pretty clear where their affections were. And they are outstanding. Butler, when he sees them drilling for the first time in 1862, he would say, quote, "I observed a very remarkable trait about them. They learned to handle arms in the march more easily than intelligent white men. My drill master could teach a regiment of Negroes that much more of their art of war sooner than he could have taught the same number of students from Harvard and Yale," close quote. They made better football players. Butler's saying this up front. But where is this training coming from? It's because they had prepared before the war. That's why they're so outstanding. Abraham Galloway, Butler would bring him out to New Orleans. He would send Galloway on a mission in the summer of 1862 up to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Abraham Galloway got captured. You know when they capture you as a spy, you know what they do to you? They execute you. Well, they didn't get a chance to execute Galloway. Galloway escaped, made his way back to North Carolina by the 1st of January, 1863. Not only does he make his way back to North Carolina, he would then go down to Confederate-occupied Wilmington and pick up his 60-plus-year-old mother and take her to freedom. Galloway was the top spy in the Civil War, and even when they captured him, they could not hold him. In South Carolina, African Americans are just as prolific. But remember Denmark, D.C.? Burned down Charleston. Remember that? That's what he said. So I call it the ghost of Denmark, D.C. When on December the 11th, 1861, Charleston was burned down. From the Cooper to the Ashley River, $8.2 million worth of damage in 1862 currency. Most devastating fire, most devastating act of sabotage in the history of the country, actually. They burned the city down, just like Denmark, Missy said they would. And then, in May of 1862, what does Robert Smalls do with 8 other African-American crewmen? They commandeer a ship. VC was a prophet. When redemption comes, you're going to burn down the city and commandeer a ship. That's exactly what happened. And I just want to point out that Robert Smalls was a Prince Hall Mason. Also in South Carolina, you have a gentleman by the name of Prince Rivers. Prince Rivers is leading guerrilla activities on the Sea Islands before the Union shows up. And that's why the planters leave the Sea Islands. Because they are afraid for their lives. Because Prince Rivers and his band of guerrilla fighters are so good. Indeed, when they come into the Union Army, Thomas Whitworth Higginson, the commander of the 1st South Carolina Infantry, would not send a European American officer on any raids that Prince Rivers was on because he wanted Prince